Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Limitless Lives. I'm your host, Nilesh Patel, and today I'm really thrilled to welcome Simon Mundie, a seasoned BBC broadcaster, author, keynote speaker, and thought leader in the realm of flow, resilience, and mental health. With over 15 years at the BBC, Simon has reported on some of the most iconic sporting events, interviewed top athletes, and renowned thinkers. He's now distilled their wisdom into his best-selling book, Champion Thinking. Simon's work dives deep into understanding the flow state, a transformative experience where we operate at our best, whether in sports, relationships, and everyday life. His journey from broadcasting at world-class events to exploring resilience, mental health, and the profound wisdom of flow offers invaluable lessons for all of us. He now shares his insights through international speaking events, impactful podcasts, and his advocacy work with the ADHD Foundation. Today, Simon is here to guide us on how to embrace flow and overcome self-imposed limitations. Simon, welcome to Limitless Lives, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you for your very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to get into this topic. You've had a remarkable career, Simon, as a BBC broadcaster and a creator of thought-provoking content. Can you share how your experiences have led you to explore the concept of flow?
Yes, so I started at the BBC on Radio 1, the leading youth radio station in the UK, in 2010. And I thought I'd really made it because it was a job that really felt out of my reach and also probably felt too good for me not long before I got it. So I got it, and it's a beautiful job because unlike most other sports broadcasting jobs over here, you get to cover every sport, and not from a too much of a geeky point of view, but really fans and going to the events, whether it be the Olympics, World Cups, Formula One, Wimbledon, etc. Really going and immersing yourself in the experience. So I absolutely loved it. And then over time, I noticed that I felt it was a bit shallow. And what I mean by that is sports reporting can focus on results and tactics and winning. And I feel like sport has so much more depth that we can learn from. There is the saying, sport is a metaphor for life. And I really wanted to explore that. And at the same time, in my own personal life, had long been on something of a quest to relieve my own psychological angst and suffering. And for a long time, those two things, my career and my self-improvement exercise, you could call it, back in the early days, were separate. And then they increasingly collided. I went abroad and I did ayahuasca in 2015. And I had a pretty intense experience where I sort of saw that my real deep interest and love was in the nature of reality, was in well-being, was in a philosophical view of life. And I thought, hang on a sec, I'm a sports reporter. They're a million miles apart. I'm doing the wrong thing. And in time thereafter, I realized actually, no, sport is a deeply spiritual pursuit, because the reason we love sport is because we lose ourselves in it. So if I think of my own experience, tennis was my favorite sport growing up. And I can still remember the first time as a boy, I connected with a forehand and was like, wow, I love the feeling of that. And then I just became obsessed with the sport. And so when I play tennis, particularly when you're really engaged in it, whether that was playing with my sister early on or tournaments later, you're so engaged with the moment that you're not thinking about what you did yesterday or what you've got coming up. And then when I moved into broadcasting, someone like Roger Federer, who is so balletic in his movement, enabled me to experience that same timelessness without playing. So with sport, you can experience that loss of time and subsequent loss of self through playing and watching. And that, I argue, is what sport is really about. That's why we love it. But because the mind is fundamentally not there during those experiences, it then comes online and we get fed those pretty simplistic narratives that sport is about winning, sport is about becoming a somebody, sport's about approval, etc. And actually, no, sport is this deeply spiritual pursuit that give us an insight into what we truly want in life. And I needed to go through that personal journey, but also that professional frustration to arrive at that insight.
And what did that insight teach you, Simon, particularly around the concept of flow?
It taught me that, in a very simple terms, we think that culturally, we think that happiness, contentment, satisfaction follow from becoming a somebody. What I mean by that is maybe it's a champion, maybe it's someone of high status, maybe it's someone with a load of money, all those things, successful. Equate that with what we really want, which is to be happy and content and fulfilled, all those things. But actually, flow in sport, but in any area, but particularly in sport, shows us that the moments that we really feel those things, contentment, connection, creativity, joy, uncaused joy, you could even argue, like that bubbles up from the inside, stems from being a nobody. So we think we want to become a somebody. We love the experience of being a nobody. So that shows to me then, well, if we love being a nobody and our sense of self can disappear, as happens during the experience of flow, then just how real is that sense of self in the first place? And so if you dig deeper into that, what is our sense of self? Well, we all have an identity, but we only have an identity relative to what's happened to us in the past and the stories that we weave around things that have happened in our life and our memories and things we've identified with, whether that be nationality or things that have happened to us or any number of things. These all congeal to become our identity. And that's who we tend to think we are. But in a moment of flow, we are so engaged with what we're doing that we're not thinking about the past at all. And so, therefore, our identity, which is created by thinking about the past in reference to the past, in that moment does not exist. But at the same time, we're not thinking about the future. We're not thinking, what have I got to do tomorrow? Or I've got this stressful meeting coming up. What if this goes wrong? Or none of that is true either. And so basically time drops away, which is, and we're familiar with this because we all have that experience of an hour going past in 10 minutes when we really love what we're doing. Maybe we're at a party or something like that, and you look up and go, oh, I can't believe that time's flown by because we're so engaged with what we're doing. Time distorts, or our experience of time distorts in accordance with how we're experiencing it. So anyone who has kids, and I know you do, and everyone's been a kid, that classic being in the car, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Because it feels boring. And so therefore we want to escape that time and time drags on. Whereas when we're really enjoying something, our experience of time is completely different. It flies by. But when we're in flow, time disappears altogether. There is no such thing as time because we're not thinking about the past. We're not thinking about the future. So our identity drops away. We merge with, it's not like I am playing tennis. There is just the playing. And that's what we love when we're not separate from the activity, from reality. So the sense of being a separate, isolated fragment, which we all have, which is the ego, that disappears. And it's such a relief to be part of the universal flow, which is, I would argue, the actual reality of things. And flow just reveals that to us. And it certainly reveals that that's what we love, not standing out and being a special somebody.
I love that. You've covered so much in terms of identity and being present and how powerful that is for the concept of flow. We definitely tend to define ourselves by labels like job titles, roles, and relationships. And we tend to lose sight of our true essence, which is what you're alluding to. And when we attach those labels, we shape how we perceive ourselves and how others see us. But when we pause to shift from those labels and reconnect with the core of who we truly are, it sounds like being present is really important to flow. But what exactly is flow, and how do you describe its essence to someone that might not be familiar with how powerful this is?
In flow, time distorts. Your sense of self disappears. So thoughts about me, thoughts of any sense of self-consciousness disappears, which is why flow is the opposite from being self-conscious, from choking in sport, those kind of thing, where we feel like everyone's watching me and our attention turns inwards. And so in flow, that completely disappears. And it's like the activity or the action is happening through us without conscious thought. We maybe are reacting, an answer comes up in the perfect moment, or in tennis, I remember a shot I hit in a particular match, and it took me by surprise. Where's that come from? There was no conscious thought gone into that. It's like the intelligent unconscious, you could say, runs 99% of the processes in our body. Like, you are not beating your heart right now. You're not doing your digestion. And yet we think, well, I am choosing my thoughts. I am choosing my actions. But in the moment of flow, you're so engaged that that deeper unconscious intelligence is coming through and is acting through you. And so basically, you're being lived in that moment, and it's a blissful experience. So we perform at our best in flow, but we also feel at our best, and it's regenerative. So flow and burnout, for example, are opposites. If you're burnt out, you're not going to get in flow. But if you can get in flow, it's regenerative and restorative, such that stress and all those kind of things, that the modern malaise, you're protected against those things. So flow is what we truly love. We lose ourselves, we feel our best, we perform our best. And there are so many portals into it, because some people get it from music. You can get it from cooking. You can get it while reading. You can get it just sitting there. You can get it certainly in relationships and certainly in conversation, all this kind of things. Because really what it does is it takes you back to what is really the case when we step out of the narratives that we tell. And you talked about, the labels we have and that we attach to. Well, I mean, the title of your podcast is Limitless Lives. Labels are limiting, and in flow we are unlimited. There is no label. And so, we're open to a far deeper universal intelligence, and really we stop being this limited concept that is what people tend to believe who they are and what we defend. And it's things that lead to that. It's that leads to tribalism and arguments and disagreements, because we feel like we are different than the other, but which is just a story. But in flow, none of that is true.
When you just allow yourself to just be, you can open the door to awareness. And within that awareness lies the gifts of freedom, joy, endless possibilities, and so much more. And I think we get caught up in this rat race, don't we, where we think that we have to keep doing something in order to achieve something. What I'm hearing you say is, if we just allow ourselves to just be, we tap back into flow, because it's already there. It's already inherently within us. And that allows us to have more fruitful conversations, better relationships, and perform better. With all that said, Simon, how can some of this cultivate our mental health, our relationships, and overall fulfillment for life?
It's fundamental, because we tend to believe that we are in the driving seat, and so we're trying to navigate this infinitely complex reality, and there are always challenges and hurdles and blocks in the way. But this is about getting out of the way and opening up to and trusting in the intelligence of life. And then there's a lot less stress, there's a lot less forcing, there's a lot less pressure, there's a lot more trusting, and you can feel yourself held by this deeper intelligence, by light, as opposed to feeling like you've got to shoulder the whole burden on your own, navigating all these infinite number of variables and, difficult people and difficult circumstances and things not going as we plan. It's about opening yourself up to the recognition, or at least the being open to the idea that there is a deeper intelligence at play, both in your body, but also in life generally, and getting in alignment with that, rather than feeling like you're battling with life. This is about getting in alignment with life. And the effect on your mental health and your physical health and your well-being is profound.
You touched on parenting earlier. How can flow help create deeper connection and harmony through parenting?
I was talking about this yesterday with a friend of mine. We went for lunch, and he's got a kid of around the same age. So my youngest daughter is 20 months. He has a son of 18 months. And before she came along, I still do, I love to have where possible, a daily meditation habit. But as you know, when you have young kids and stuff, carving out time for yourself can be a little bit precarious, because you're not in control of your schedule. And so what I find is, for example, when I put my daughter to sleep, so my wife gives her the bath, I'll then take her into her bedroom, give her some milk, and then what I do is I walk with her, carrying her. That's how she likes to go to sleep. Now, I don't know how long that's going to take. That could take 5 minutes, or it could take an hour and 20 minutes. And so that at that moment that is right there. That's my meditation. Now, the guy I spoke to yesterday said he found the fact that he wasn't able to plan and he wasn't able to be in control of how his time unfolded very difficult. So he was in resistance to what is. But I think that the beauty of flow is it's about getting in alignment with how things are. And therefore, when your kids, of whatever age, for example, are not doing what you want them to do, instead of being like, oh, they should be doing what I want them to do, it's far more like, no, this is what's happening. I can be in alignment with this as much as possible. Now, that doesn't mean you don't tell them off or anything like that, of course, but I can be in alignment with this and stop resisting the way things are by having this idea of how things should be and instead being in alignment with how things are. And then you'll have much more mental space to respond skillfully rather than be reactive because you're thinking this shouldn't be happening. And you can apply that to sport. You can apply that to business. You can apply that to any area of your life. You're not resisting how things are by clinging to this idea of how things should be.
That's really powerful because it's an energy exchange as well. Because if you're going to fully embrace it rather than resist it, the other person involved in that, in this case, your daughter, she picks up on your energy.
Yeah.
Right? So you're now in this flow state with someone else and you're exchanging that energy between you and her. And that helps you both reconnect back to this higher level of intelligence and trusting the intelligence of life, as you put it earlier. So I think that's so powerful. And I shared that with a couple of colleagues at work when we were talking about how do they navigate uncertainty. And one of the examples I gave them was when you're holding a baby, if the baby is crying constantly and you start stressing out and your energy is off, that baby picks up on that energy. It's not going to calm the baby. So you've lost that ability to connect with yourself in flow, but also with the child. However, if you are able to regulate your emotions, be at one with yourself, that energy that you have within you, people pick up on that too. And that automatically helps calm the baby.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Very simply, you're not having an idea of how things should be. You're in alignment with how things are. So of course you're more peaceful and accepting and relaxing. Now that doesn't mean, for example, you don't get stressed or frustrated, but those are also how things are happening. In Buddhist terms, there's the two arrows. There's the first arrow of pain that is inherent in life, but the second arrow is the resistance to the pain. So what we're talking about here is being in alignment with how things are, flowing with how things are. And the more you do that, I find the more you can trust that the right response will come at the right moment. So that could be whether that's in parenting, knowing how to deal with a difficult situation, how to navigate something social, something at work. You don't have to stress about things, but instead you can trust that when the moment comes, the right response will also be there.
As human beings, sometimes we feel disconnected or stuck, whether in our professional lives or in our personal relationships. What steps do you feel people can bring to allow flow into their daily work or life to be more purposeful?
I think first thing would be is to get a bit of distance from your thought and to realize that you are not your thoughts. You know, we all have this voice in our head, this narrative going around, and we also have this idea that we are in control of our thoughts. Someone I saw posted recently, and it was obviously well intentioned, something along the lines of think positively always. Well, I would say that's not only not very helpful advice, it's also impossible. Because if I take a moment, whoever's listening, but you too, think, do you know what thought you're going to have next? No. No
No.
one knows what thought they're going to have next. But a thought comes up, and then we have this illusion of, oh, I chose that thought. And so what I'd say is to recognize that thoughts arise on their own. And then if you can get that a little bit of space between you and your thoughts, and the way I did this, or the way I was introduced to this very early on, a couple of ways of looking at it, and I talk about this in my book. First of all, is to recognize that, well, think of it in these terms. So we have a thinking mind. So which is the part of the mind that is churning up thoughts. And most of the thoughts, by the way, tend to be self-referential, i.e. they're focused around me. So we all walk around life experiencing the world through, oh, what does this mean for me? What did this person think of me? How am I doing? Why are they doing so much better than me? Blah, blah, blah. Even, for example, seemingly altruistic actions and thoughts, often there'll be a little me hidden in there. Oh, this makes me a good person, for example. And so the majority of our thinking is about me in one way or other, which is normal. It's a survival mechanism. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way it tends to be. That's the way the mind happens to work. But if you pay attention to your thinking, you've got the thinking mind, you'll also notice that there's something more subtle there that most people are oblivious to and overlook. And that's the observing or aware mind. So there's something that is aware of our thoughts. When a thought comes up, we have the capacity to say, oh, that's a good thought, that's a bad thought, value judgments, which I wouldn't agree with. But where's that thought come from? I'm not going to follow that thought, whatever it may be, all these kind of things. I shouldn't be thinking things like that. Well, that means for us to have that level of perspective, that means there has to be something that is aware of the thought in the first place. So you can separate, at least from an understanding point of view, into there's the thinking mind, the thoughts, and then there's the aware mind. Whatever it is that is aware of the thoughts, that is seeing the thoughts or hearing the thoughts. Now, itself is not a thought because it's subtle. It doesn't have definitive properties in the same way that a thought itself does. A thought has a beginning and an end. It has a texture to it, a frequency almost, whereas the aware mind itself does not. It's subtle. It's like the space in a room. We tend to overlook it as a result. But the more that you can actually notice that, yes, there is something that is aware of my thoughts, it's actually undeniable, then you've opened up a world of possibility. And then what I did years ago was I started using something called a diffusion technique, which is about defusing from your thoughts, because so often our thinking's going on and we are so identified with it, we think that it is us. But if you can defuse from a thought, and here's how you can do it, then you create that space. So let's say you had a thought, you got a business presentation, a work presentation. I'm going to mess this presentation up. Now, obviously, that's going to be somewhat stress inducing. And most people might do one or two things. Try and ignore a thought like that. And that's a form of suppression. And suppressing thoughts or feelings is not a good idea because there's a lot of evidence that they bounce back even stronger. Or to try and get into, let's say, you challenge it with another thought or think positively, as some people say. You could think, oh, hang on, I've done this before. I know I'm sure I can do this well. I don't know that I'm going to mess it up, etc., etc. And then you're having a conversation in your mind, not realizing that you're on both sides of the conversation. And that's why people talk often about self-talk. Talk to yourself positively. Well, there is a third option, which is just to observe the thought and recognize that it is just thought. And what is a thought? It's a word, it's sounds, it's images passing through the mind, a bit like clouds in the sky. Now, you're not the clouds, you are the sky. And so, therefore, if you can observe the thought, and then you might add a little prefix like, I'm aware of the thought X. So, I'm going to mess this presentation up becomes, oh, you notice it. And then you go, I'm aware of the thought that I'm going to mess this up. And then all of a sudden, that immediately has a different texture to it because it's no longer a fact. There's just a bit more space. You are not the thought, you're aware of it. Then you don't have to ignore it. You can acknowledge it. Oh, it's a thought. You don't have to try and change it. You don't have to think positively. You can just notice it for what it is and allow it to pass by like a cloud in the sky. And the more you do that, the more you realize you're not your thoughts. You are this aware space in which the thoughts are rising and falling. And the more you do that, that aware space goes from being invisible, and I'm borrowing someone else's terminology here, invisible to subtle to obvious. And the more it rises from, I mean, it's always there. It's always present. It's as present in me or anyone listening it's equally as present in whoever's listening and yourself as it is in me. But the point is the degree to which we're aware of this awareness. And the more that we become aware of it, the more obvious it becomes, and then the more obvious, and then whatever thought or feeling or indeed perception or experience arises, the more we can just allow it to be and go with the flow of it, rather than trying to tinker within it with our internal experience in particular, which takes a lot of energy and often is pretty fruitless. So that would be my advice would be to cultivate it, is to get that distance from your thought, use that diffusion technique, increasingly become aware of the aware mind. And then once you've started to develop that with thoughts, then take it into feelings, because we often have uncomfortable sensations in the body we want to try and get rid of. Instead of doing that, cut the storyline or the narrative around the sensation and become aware of the sensation itself. And without a storyline, it's just this tingling, vibrating field. And again, you don't have to resist it. You don't have to try and ignore it. You can just be aware of it and allow it to come and go in its own time. And then you can even do the same with every element of experience. What you can see, what you can hear, what you can feel. They're all aspects of our experience that we are aware of. And this awareness, this aware presence, that is the fundamental part of any element of experience. The more we can be in touch with that and cultivate that through the ways I've spoken about, the more it's always available for us to take refuge in whatever is happening in our internal or external experience.
I love this approach because it helps prevent negative feelings from festering and reduces negative self talk, along with the ego that can creep in. On a previous episode, I touched on the importance of exploring the awareness that observes our thoughts. And you made me think about that conversation, Simon. If I'm feeling angry, I tend to say hello to that feeling, whether it's anger, fear. I will literally have a silent conversation and say, "Hello, anger, I see you there."
Yeah.
It's as if I've become aware of the emotion, recognizing it without letting it consume me. And what I typically tend to see and feel happens within myself is that I'm acknowledging that it's there. Anger almost takes a pause and is like, hang on a minute. What do you mean you see me? And it diffuses to the approach you've just taken. And I love that you've shared that thought and process.
Can I just jump in and just say one thing about what you just said there? I
Please.
I think that's beautiful, and not only are you observing it and detaching from it, but you're also not resisting it, and it's the resistance that causes suffering. If we resist feelings or resist thoughts, not only is there that old saying, "What you resist persists," but then it becomes problematic because again, we're taking the stance that this should not be here, this anger should not be here. Now, I was watching a video this week where Ram Dass was speaking to Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist author and scholar,
Yep.
both passed away. And he was talking to him about anger specifically and welcoming anger. And Thich Nhat Hanh was about holding anger like a mother holds a child. And so you talked about welcoming that. Absolutely. What we need to be doing with all our inner experience is not battling it, but allowing it, welcoming it, because that is what allows it to unravel somewhat, to relax and not grip as hard. But when we resist it, when we try and get rid of it, and that includes by, for example, positive thinking or anything like that, then actually what we're doing is we're creating a bit of separation and amplifying it.
I love that. And that's really important to hit home on because when you talk about suppression, it builds up in our body and that can create all sorts of other problems or illnesses, or it'll come back up again later in an argument that you're having about a completely different topic. Resentment starts to build, doesn't it? And you don't want that in your day to day life.
No, I don't want to carry unnecessary baggage.
Absolutely. I'd love to touch on something you mentioned earlier about athletes and sports. That's a big aspect of your professional life, and some of the realizations you had about flow came from that. You've spent time with some of the most accomplished athletes and performers. In your experience, how have they accessed flow, and what lessons can we learn from their approach?
They access flow on the whole unintentionally because it's difficult to do it consciously because again we tend to think we are the voice in our head. We tend to think we're the doer of our actions. And so, just this idea of how do I get flow? For me, that whole self-referential thought again, me, I want flow. Well, the paradox is it's that me that needs to be out of the way for flow to emerge. And so if I think of some examples. I think with athletes, let's say the conscious, deliberate practice. You do the drills, you practice your forehand, your backhand, your batting, your driving, whatever it might be, and then you go into the moment of where you're competing, let's say, and in that moment. You're so focused that there's the muscle memory, there's the drills already in your body. But then because you're so focused, it all drops away. And so many people have described it in terms that I remember Johnny Wilkinson, who kicked the winning drop goal in 2003 to win England the Rugby World Cup, said, it wasn't me kicking it, it was a knowing of it. Frankie Dettori said when he rode 6 winners in a day on the last one, which was a complete no-hoper, he said, I was there, but I wasn't there. It's hard to explain. And then Damon Hill and his greatest ever Formula One world champion back in the day, on what was his best drive, he said it was like something else was driving the car. So there's this dual experience of being aware of what's happening, but not feeling like the doer of it, or feeling like there's a me at the center of it, choosing to do X, Y, Z. It's just happening. And so what I would say is, yes, do the practice or whatever, but it has to follow focus firstly. So the way we live our lives now is, we tend to be distracted. We tend to try and multitask. We've got notifications coming in. We on our phones. We're jumping from one thing to the next. That is no way facilitate the experience of flow and selflessness, which we love. But if you can be focused on something and you can stretch your attention, then you're giving yourself a chance, because it emerges from when we just really engage with something. It can come through us. Now you can't control it, really. I mean, there are some things I've spoken to people about who say there is a formula to flow, and I can share that. There's a guy I interviewed who said it goes along these lines, where struggle, release, flow, recover. So struggle, you have a phase. Let's say, so I actually did this when I was writing my book. Let's say you work on a problem for a period. So I would work on my book and with a view to writing 500 words, and I would work on it for 3 hours. I'd turn my phone off. I was working in a cafe, so I had a bit of white noise. I'd put my earplugs in, I'd face the wall, and I'd work on my book for 3 hours. Then a timer would go off. And that 3 hours could be difficult because I wasn't getting the answers I needed. And the urge to scratch the itch by, for example, scrolling at social media or reading the news was there because it was challenging. And then at the end of that 3 hour period, the alarm would go off and I would take myself up and I would go for a swim and I would have a steam. So I'd swim in a steam room. So for about half an hour. And in that period, I'm no longer thinking about the problem, which in this case was the book, but my mind, the unconscious, the intelligent unconscious is still working on it. And so I'd be swimming and the brain, the mind, whatever is working on the problem, right? Then I would come back and also I'd have dissipated some of the stress hormones that accumulated through the struggle phase. So they're gone. The cortisol's gone, the adrenaline's gone. I've got rid of it through some low grade exercise, swimming and steam. And I'd come back to the writing and I would have a lot of the answers that had previously been evading me in that previous 3 hour period. They had just emerged. They had been processed and allowed to emerge during the period when I was not actually thinking about it. And then I came back to it and all of a sudden, they're just there. So that's the struggle, release, flow, and then recover as well. So people talk about that phase being key on the back end after flow, in that you don't want to then be scrolling. You don't want to do anything like that. You want to put yourself or your body into a state of where it can recover so that you can try and do the same thing the next day, rather than distracting yourself or scrolling or watching telly or whatever. Like, just going back to what you said earlier, it's just about being. And I think that can be quite helpful, but it's no guarantee. But fundamentally, I think the more you can get that gap from your mind, the more you can allow and trust that, again, that the answers that you want are in there, and allow them to come. And the more you trust that unconscious, the deeper intelligence, life, whatever you want to say, then the more likely I would suggest that flow will come, because you're not scrabbling around trying to find it. You're open to it and you're surrendering to it and not trying to control it. Because you try and control it, you're chasing it, and then you're not going to get it.
How do people that really struggle with self doubt embrace this intelligence? Because it's there, we have it, but we become nervous, we're scared, or the voice in our head keeps going. What would you say to people that have or experience self doubt on a day to day basis, and how they can really tap into flow?
First of all, I'd say it's valuable to recognize that it's a universal phenomenon. There are so many articles at the moment about, for example, imposter syndrome. And I do talks for businesses and sports teams and universities and schools and individuals. And whenever I ask about imposter syndrome, and the symptoms obviously of imposter syndrome are a sense of I might be found out, or I don't really know what I'm doing, or I doubt myself, all those things. And I say, has anyone ever not experienced these things? I've never met anyone, or I've never been in a room where someone hasn't put their hand up in a big group, or if I'm working with someone one-to-one, they haven't said, no, I do experience this. So first of all, is to recognize it's a universal phenomenon to doubt yourself. to have doubting thoughts. It's your brain trying to keep you safe, because the brain is naturally on the lookout for, has a negativity bias, which makes total sense. It's important that you look out for what might go wrong, because if you don't and you're completely blasé, you might end up doing something that could take your own life. And survival is the first prerogative of, the human nervous system. So first thing, I think just understanding that everyone feels self-doubt can be somewhat reassuring, because I think a lot of people feel like, oh, this is just me, everyone else doesn't have this. And that's definitely not true. We tend to judge people's insides from their outsides. And even the most confident looking person, you might have had a panic attack earlier that day, you don't know. And so I think that's part one, is to recognize the universality of it. Then number two is to, again, when these things do come up in the form of thoughts and feelings, observe it, allow it, welcome it, and then crack on and do what you need to do regardless. Use the diffusion technique. Use what you said about, hello, anger, hello, doubt, come on in. There's a lovely quote by Rumi, who said something like, fear, doubt, shame, malice, meet them at the door like a guest, something like that. I've mangled that quote, but it's something along those lines. The point, again, to what he said is to understand these are normal, and to not try and get rid of them or not argue with them, but to welcome them and make friends with them and make peace with them. And when you do that, actually, let's say fear or adrenaline that comes with these things, they can actually end up then being your greatest ally, because you can use those things and channel them into the energy you need to perform at those key moments. But it's just the storyline we have about these sensations that is problematic. Because I'll give you an example. Imagine two people on a roller coaster. One person is super excited about going on this ride, another is terrified. Now, physiologically, they could be having the same experience internally, but one person's got a storyline about those sensations that's different. One is saying, oh, I don't want this. The other's saying, oh, I love these sensations. Now, if you cut that storyline, by cutting, I mean, don't buy into it and notice it's there and allow it, then you can alchemize a feeling of doubt to one of excitement. Because again, physiologically, they're not hugely different. To summarize what I've just been saying, recognize that these are all parts of the human condition. As Rumi suggested, welcome them at the door, don't resist and fight them, and then just get a bit of a space from these things, from our thoughts and from our feelings. Recognize that they are clouds passing in the sky, and you're not the clouds, you are the sky. And as such, you can't be hurt by these clouds. And the more you can observe and allow them and welcome them and realize that they provide some content for the sky to enjoy, then that is a way to embrace the freedom that is inherent in being.
The sun is always there. Everything else is just the weather.
Whatever the weather, the sky is always behind it, and the sky is untouched by the weather. The problem we have is we tend to think we are the weather.
That's a beautiful way of describing it, Simon. And a lot of your work is about fulfillment and living a meaningful life. And I'd love to wrap up the conversation today by getting one piece of advice. I mean, you've shared so much with us today, but what's one actionable piece of advice that you can share with our listeners to help them live a life without limits?
I would say to get in touch with our intuition, and our intuition is best accessed through stillness. And so we're not used to being still, and you could put another word in there, bored. I know you obviously live in Texas, where it's a lot more orientated around cars, but in the UK where I live, near London, if I want to go up into town, as I did yesterday, I'll get the train. And I'm always interested to see that on a platform, when people are waiting for a train, they tend to be on their phones. So we typically now, as a species, rush to fill any still or down moment with content. Because again, it's overlooking the value of stillness, the value of emptiness, the value of awareness and the aware mind. But the more, when you have a moment, perhaps you're queuing to get a drink or some food, or you've got a journey or whatever it may be, when there are those moments in the day where you have nothing to do, so you're waiting for something, do nothing but wait. Be still. And the more you can do that, and the more you can get comfortable with nothing, with just being in any environment, the more the noise of our conditioned thoughts and our mind can settle down. And then often what I find is the deeper intuition that knows, in my view, what the next thing we should do, then we can start tuning into that and trusting it and living in accordance with it, rather than, oh, what are the pros and cons? What do I think I should do? Because all of those are thoughts conditioned by our environment, by the people around us, by societal expectation, family expectation, et cetera, rather than this deeper knowing that I know is where true sort of wisdom and intelligence lies. And I'll just finish with a quick story. I have a gran who is going to be 103 in a couple of months. She still lives on her own in Scotland, and she's lived this way her whole life. She says whenever she's hit a fork in the road, she will get still and an answer will come about which direction to take. And oftentimes it will be a difficult direction, but she says, and remember, she's 103, it's never let her down. And so I think the more that we can get in touch with that intuition and trust it, the more that we experience flow, the more that we experience that there is something deeper at work. There's an order behind the apparent chaos of life. There's an interconnectedness to all life. And then the more that we can be in alignment with that and experience more of what we've been talking about in our day-to-day life.
I love that intuition and trusting the intelligence of life. And your grandmother is a great example of that. It's worked for her for nearly 103 years.
Absolutely. And it comes though from the stillness. You've got to get still. You've got to get away from this constant busyness, constant doing, constant scrolling, constant activity. Get still to be able to get in touch with what we're talking about.
Simon, I want to thank you so much. And it's been a true joy to have you on the show. So thank you once again.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all the listeners to tuning in to another episode of Limitless Lives. I hope you feel inspired to explore the power of flow in your own life. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with a friend. And don't forget to tap follow on your preferred podcast platform. Until the next time, embrace the journey and live without limits.